Occoquan wasn't a large town, but it carried the kind of silence that pressed into your ears. On most nights, I'd hear the distant hum of the river or the creak of trees swaying in the wind. Tonight, though, the air felt unnaturally still, heavy with something unspoken. I parked my car along a quiet street lined with houses that seemed to lean into the dark. A single streetlight flickered above me, casting jittery shadows on the asphalt. As I stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded louder than it should have, like the town itself was holding its breath. "Detective Samra," I said aloud, testing my voice in the silence. It didn't help. I glanced at the case file in my hand, a string of murders, each more unsettling than the last. Families found dead in their own homes, their faces frozen in grotesque smiles. The official reports listed them as murder-suicides. The unofficial whispers called it something worse. The name, Sweet Tooth, scrawled in block letters across a report page caught my attention again. Witness accounts described him as a charming neighbor, always quick with a smile. A good man, they said, until he wasn't. Sweet Tooth had a way of drawing people in, convincing them to follow him down paths they couldn't return from. A chill prickled the back of my neck as I approached the Johnsons' house, the most recent crime scene. The door creaked open under my gloved hand, revealing a home frozen in time. Plates sat untouched on the dinner table. A child's toy lay abandoned on the floor, and the faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air. "Stay sharp," I muttered to myself, stepping inside. The weight of the silence here was different, almost oppressive. Something about this place felt wrong. I paused in the hallway, noticing a pattern of smudged fingerprints leading toward the basement door. My gut tightened, but I forced myself forward. This wasn't my first investigation, but it already felt like the most unsettling one I'd taken on. Something about Sweet Tooth wasn't just dangerous, it was personal. And I was about to find out why. The town of Occoquan had a way of swallowing things whole: secrets, scandals, even people. Its history was peppered with half-forgotten tragedies, each story buried beneath layers of polite smiles and small-town pleasantries. But this felt different. The Johnsons weren't the first, but they'd been the tipping point. A family of 4, wiped out in one night. The neighbors had heard nothing, no screams, no commotion. Just silence until the next morning when Mrs. Evelyn from 2 doors down found the front door ajar and called the police. The scene that greeted them was grotesque. Parents seated at the dinner table, their faces locked in a rictus grin. The children upstairs tucked into bed with matching smiles. The reports couldn't explain the sheer wrongness of it. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. Toxicology tests came back clean, but the looks on their faces. It was as if they'd seen something, believed something so utterly consuming that it destroyed them. I'd spent the better part of the last week piecing together their lives, trying to make sense of it all. Michael Johnson, a hardware store manager, and his wife, Claire, a school teacher, were about as ordinary as they came. No history of violence, no debts, no enemies. They'd moved here 3 years ago for a quieter life, according to their friends. But something had changed in the last 6 months. Claire had become withdrawn, skipping her usual morning coffee meetups. Michael had taken to spending long hours in the yard, digging without explanation. Then there was the man. Sweet Tooth, I murmured, the name heavy on my tongue. Neighbors described him with an unnerving mix of fondness and fear. He was the kind of man who'd charm a room, the sort you'd invite over for a barbecue without a second thought. But there was always something off. No one could quite place where he'd come from. One woman insisted he'd lived in town for years, while another swore he'd only arrived last summer. And then there were the notes. Each family that had fallen victim left behind a journal, a diary, or scribbled fragments of thoughts. They all mentioned him Sweet Tooth and a strange promise he'd made. Something about devotion and a brighter world beyond this one. I closed the case file, my eyes burning from hours of reading. The pieces didn't fit, and the more I learned, the more they unraveled. It wasn't just the Johnsons or the families before them. Sweet Tooth wasn't just a man. He was an idea, a shadow slipping through the cracks of Occoquan. And if I didn't stop him, he'd find his next family soon enough. I stood outside the Johnsons' house, its peeling white paint gleaming faintly under the overcast sky. There was nothing remarkable about the place, yet something about it clawed at my nerves. Occoquan was no stranger to tragedy, but this wasn't just another sad story. It felt wrong, like the house itself had absorbed the horror and was waiting to exhale it. Inside, the air was cold and still, as if the house were holding its breath. The dining table remained set, the bloodstains scrubbed clean, but the memories lingering. I circled the room, scanning for anything the forensics team might have missed. A faint, sweet smell like candied apples hung in the air. It wasn't strong, but it made my stomach churn. The neighbors' accounts replayed in my mind. Sweet Tooth, they said, had visited often in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. He'd come by with small gifts, homemade cookies, jars of honey claiming they were from his special collection. Claire loved his visits, Evelyn had told me during our interview, her voice trembling. Said he made her feel seen. Said he understood things no one else did. Evelyn had paused, her face pale. But Michael, he started talking about a reckoning. Said Sweet Tooth had shown him something beautiful. I turned toward the staircase, hesitating before climbing. The children's room was untouched, a snapshot of innocence preserved in time. Stuffed animals crowded the bed, their lifeless button eyes staring at me. A crumpled piece of paper peeked out from beneath a pillow. It was a drawing, a crude sketch of a man with an impossibly wide smile, holding hands with two children. Above him, in uneven letters, was written, "He will take us to the sweet place." I swallowed hard, stuffing the paper into my pocket. Back at the precinct, I spread out everything I had. Crime scene photos, testimonies, reports. Each one hinted at Sweet Tooth, but none could pin him down. Who was he? Why had no one else in town noticed how he seemed to vanish after each family's demise? As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stared at my cluttered desk, frustration mounting. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. When I answered, the voice was calm, almost amused. "Detective Samra," it said, "you've been asking about me." "Let's talk." The voice on the phone had a strange warmth to it, like an old friend you hadn't seen in years. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about it. "Where are you?" I demanded, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you want with these families?" The voice laughed, soft and chilling. "I don't want anything. I'm giving them what they need, what they've always wanted. They were just too blind to see it." There was a pause, as if considering my reaction. "But you'll understand soon. You'll see." The line went dead. I sat there for a moment, the silence pressing against my eardrums. I dialed the number back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I slammed the phone down, the frustration almost boiling over. Whoever this man was, he was playing a game, a dangerous one, and I was falling right into his hands. As I sat there, trying to steady my breathing, my mind raced. I couldn't afford to ignore the connection between Sweet Tooth and the deaths of these families. But I wasn't sure if I was dealing with a mastermind or something worse, a force I didn't understand. The phone call had brought a new urgency, but it also felt like a distraction. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something in the details, something small, something important. The way people talked about Sweet Tooth, the reverence, the unease, the way their voices seemed to tremble when they described him told me this wasn't just a man. This was something bigger, and he had followers. I needed to dig deeper. I couldn't rely on just the facts. I had to understand what had drawn these families in, what had made them so willing to give up everything for Sweet Tooth's promises. The reports mentioned that some of the victims had records of strange behavior before their deaths. Michael Johnson had started showing up at work late, speaking in cryptic phrases about the truth and the end of suffering. Claire had left a note, torn and smudged with ink, about a sweet salvation. What was the sweet place they kept talking about? I stood up, pacing back and forth in the dim light of my office. My thoughts scattered like a jigsaw puzzle, pieces not quite fitting together. Was this a cult? Or was it something more insidious, something that preyed on the vulnerable, convincing them of some twisted salvation? One thing was clear. I had to find Sweet Tooth before he struck again. But I had no idea where to begin. The following day, I arrived at Crane Mansion before dawn, my nerves on edge. The mansion, perched ominously on the hill overlooking the town, seemed even more imposing in the gray morning light. The air was thick, but it wasn't the usual chill of a winter morning. It was something else, something unnatural. Inside, the place was eerily silent, the only sound the echo of my footsteps on the cold stone floors. The walls seemed to close in around me, their dark, cracked surfaces telling stories that no one would ever hear. I had been here before, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air, as if the house itself were waiting for something. I could feel the eyes of my team, watching me with a mixture of concern and confusion. I had insisted we investigate further, despite the risks, despite the warnings. The rumors had grown louder, and I was getting closer to the truth. But the truth was elusive, slipping away every time I thought I had a firm grip on it. We moved through the mansion slowly, searching each room with a sense of dread gnawing at our insides. As I stepped into one of the back rooms, I froze. There on the floor was something I wasn't prepared for. A fresh body, a woman, her eyes wide open in horror. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. It was the way she was positioned, her limbs arranged in an unnatural pose, as if someone had meticulously placed her. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I bent down to examine her. The details were haunting. Her skin had started to decompose, but there were no signs of trauma. Her hands were clasped in a prayer-like position, her fingers stiff and cold. And then I saw a small handwritten note tucked into her hand. I could barely make out the words, but the ink was unmistakable. "He's coming for you, detective." Sweet Tooth sees everything. I staggered back, my breath shallow. The message hit me like a punch to the chest. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Sweet Tooth was here. The room around me seemed to warp, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. I could feel it, a presence, watching me, waiting for me to understand. And then I heard a sound. Soft at first, but growing louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, each echoing off the walls, reverberating through my bones. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, my heart racing. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if someone or something was really in the room with us. "Samra," a voice broke through the tension. It was Officer Daniels, his voice strained with uncertainty. I turned to face him, but he was staring at the doorway behind me, his eyes wide, pupils dilated in fear. I slowly turned around, my hand instinctively reaching for my weapon. The doorframe was empty, but I could feel the oppressive weight of something unseen, something monstrous. The air felt thick, suffocating, and my throat tightened as if I was choking on the very atmosphere. I needed to move, to act, but my legs wouldn't respond. I could barely breathe, let alone think. All the weight of the investigation, all the strange occurrences, everything I had tried to dismiss came crashing down at once. "Get out of here, now," Daniels shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. But I didn't want to leave. Something was calling me deeper into the mansion, something I couldn't explain, but something that felt as if it were pulling at the very core of my being. "No," I whispered, trying to break free from his grip. "I need to find the truth." Daniels, in a panic, yanked me toward the exit with a strength I hadn't known he had. We stumbled out of the room, back into the hallway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching us. I could almost hear the laughter, and somewhere, deep inside, I knew Sweet Tooth wasn't finished with me. We were safe. For now. I woke up in my hotel room hours later, the weight of exhaustion pressing on my chest. The events of the mansion seemed surreal, almost like a bad dream, but I knew better than to dismiss them. The sense of unease lingered in every part of me, the kind of fear that doesn't go away with the dawn, that doesn't vanish with sleep. Sitting up, I gripped the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I couldn't let it end like this. I'd come too far to back down now. What happened at the Crane Mansion wasn't just a string of coincidences. It was something deliberate, something personal. Sweet Tooth was still out there, and whatever grip he had on those families, it wasn't over. I needed answers. I found myself standing before the mirror, staring at my own reflection. The woman I saw wasn't just a detective anymore. I had become something else, something hardened, something scarred. The fear still clawed at me, but now there was resolve. I couldn't let him control me, couldn't let whatever evil was festering out there continue. The next move was mine. I reached for my phone and dialed Daniels. His voice, tight with tension, answered almost immediately. "Samra? You okay?" I swallowed hard. "I need you to meet me at the archives." "We're not done yet." There was a long pause on the other end, but then he sighed. "All right, I'll be there in 20. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small step forward. I had no illusions. This was bigger than I'd imagined. But I had a job to do, and Sweet Tooth wasn't going to escape. Not if I could help it. The air was thick with tension as Daniels and I stood in the dimly lit archive room, the smell of old paper and dust hanging in the air. The heavy silence was broken only by the occasional shuffle of files as we dug through the records. My mind was a jumble of thoughts, Sweet Tooth's manipulations, the deaths, the disappearances. There had to be something here, something that tied all the pieces together. "You think this is going to give us something new?" Daniels asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. I didn't look up from the files. "It has to. There's a pattern. These families, they didn't just die, they were pulled into this web. Someone or something is controlling them." Daniels paused, flipping through a stack of records, then sighed. "Samra, I don't know what to tell you. You saw what happened in that house. People disappear and come back wrong. We should be getting backup, calling in the authorities, not chasing ghosts." His words were like a slap, but I couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. "Not now. Backup won't help," I muttered, my eyes scanning over a name in one of the files. "This isn't just a crime scene, Daniels. This is something else." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I continued reading. A familiar name kept popping up. Crane. The mansion's original owner, and something even darker. There were hints, scratched out notes, references to rituals, to a figure in the shadows, a name only whispered. Sweet Tooth. He wasn't just a figure in the past. He was here, he was now. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. I slammed the file shut, meeting Daniel's confused gaze. "We need to go back to the mansion." He shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're insane." "No, I'm the only one who can stop this." We didn't waste any time. By the time we arrived back at Crane Mansion, the sky had shifted to an eerie shade of dark purple, the air crackling with an energy I couldn't explain. My heart raced as I gripped the handle of my flashlight, its beam trembling in the damp silence. The mansion loomed ahead, its once grand architecture now just a hollow shell, as if even the building itself was being consumed by whatever haunted it. Daniel stayed close, his every step cautious, but I could feel his doubt. I didn't care. I had to end this. We entered through the front door, the hinges creaking in protest, and immediately the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the air. The walls, stained with time and neglect, seemed to pulse with a low hum, as if the house itself was alive, aware of our intrusion. I moved quickly, each room a maze of forgotten memories. The smell of rot was stronger now. We reached the basement door, the very place where it all began. I hesitated only for a moment before swinging it open. Inside, the shadows were thick, impenetrable. And then I saw him, Sweet Tooth. He was standing at the far end of the room, his back to us. The same sinister smile curled on his lips, but this time, it wasn't just a grin. It stretched unnaturally, as though the skin on his face was being forced into the shape. His eyes glowed no longer human. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered, the words slithering into my ears. His voice was like a chant, familiar and foreign all at once. I raised my gun, but it felt useless. The air grew heavier, suffocating. "Samra," Daniels whispered, his voice barely audible. It was then I realized we weren't just dealing with a man anymore. We were facing something much worse. The room twisted. The shadows around Sweet Tooth seemed to stretch and warp, as if the very fabric of reality was bending. I could barely breathe, the air thick with the weight of something ancient. My mind screamed at me to act, to do something, anything, but my body was frozen. Sweet Tooth turned slowly, his grotesque smile now a jagged, impossible thing. His eyes, those glowing eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt my pulse hammer in my chest. You're not meant to stop me," he whispered, his voice echoing in the very walls. "You're part of the design, Samra." His words cut through me like a knife. Everything I'd seen, everything I'd fought for, it was all leading to this moment. A realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't about saving anyone anymore. It never was. I raised my gun, my hand shaking, but before I could pull the trigger, a sharp, searing pain exploded in my head. I stumbled back, vision blurring. Then, as the world around me shattered, I understood. Sweet Tooth was never alone, and whatever he was, it was far from over. I woke up to darkness. No light, no sound, just an oppressive silence. My mind raced, but the fog was thick. I was on the floor of the mansion, alive, but barely. The others. Daniels? I couldn't remember. The last thing I could focus on was Sweet Tooth's voice, the damn voice echoing in my ears. "Still here, Samra?" I didn't move. Couldn't. There was nothing left to fight. The walls seemed to close in, the house breathing around me. My flashlight flickered on the floor next to me, the beam weak and trembling. I could still feel the presence, looming just beyond the edges of my vision. Someone was watching me. And that smile never left my mind. I knew one thing for sure now. Sweet Tooth was still out there, and it wasn't over. It would never be over. The darkness pressed down harder, suffocating, until I could feel it consume me. Then, just as my consciousness started to slip away, I heard it a whisper, soft and chilling. "Sweet Tooth still walks free," and I realized I was just another one of his many victims.